Well, hello everyone. Welcome to the InfraGard Atlanta webinar series. Today we're going to be talking about cyber supply chain attacks. Should we be afraid of our third-party vendors? Firstly, I want to thank everyone for joining. A couple of quick background information and some disclaimers. InfraGard, as some of you know, is a non-profit organization. It's a private public industry partnership between U.S. businesses and the FBI. If anyone is interested in applying for membership, please go to our InfraGard national website, infragard.org. A quick disclaimer, the views and opinions of all of today's webinar panelists are their own opinion and not those of InfraGard Atlanta or InfraGard National. So without further ado, I'd like to just thank our chapter sponsors. We have a number of chapter sponsors that help put on these webinars and also support the Atlanta chapter. And want to thank you, all of you, for your participation, and encourage all of today's attendees to please, connect with our sponsors and engage with them. Now, the webinar today is sponsored by iTrust, who helps business build trusted relationships with their vendors, partners, and suppliers. As it happens to be, coincidentally, ties into today's topic very nicely. All right, I wanted to introduce our first panelist, my friend Joe Dyer. Joe, would you like to say a few words?
Sure. As Trevor said, I'm Joe Dyer. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer at ICF. And ICF is a global management consulting and professional services company with a wide range of services, both in the government as well as commercial sector. We are in the energy, environmental, infrastructure, health, social programs, public health, cybersecurity, and defense. We have about 6,000 employees across about 70 offices worldwide. And I'm ultimately responsible for the ICF's Global Information Security Program. Been in the industry and technology for about 35 years now. And in information security, I would say a little 15, actually 16 years now.
Thanks, Joe, and thank you so much for being on our panel. My other panelist today is also my good friend, Jeff Reach. Jeff, would you like to say a few words?
Sure. Thank you, Trevor, and welcome to Joe as well. I have been in the risk management and information security sector for about 40 years. A number of things I've done of usually starting security and risk programs. I started the program at Dell. I started the program at Rackspace, and some in the financial services area as well. Right now, I'm doing two things. I'm a co-founder and chief operating officer at Lexalign PBC, which happens to deal with third-party risk for auto dealers. And I'm also a senior information security instructor at the Center for Information Assurance and Security at the University of Texas, San Antonio, which is the only title I've ever had where I usually run out of breath right before I finish. I've been involved in, as I said, for 40 years, helped back in the beginnings with ISSA and ISC Squared and InfraGard. I have a few certifications and designations, and I'm very proud of those, and I'm really pleased to be here today.
Thank you. Thanks again for being on the panel. And then myself, I'm Trevor Horwitz, the CEO and co-founder at TrustNet. I've also been at about 20 years background in cybersecurity and compliance. TrustNet provides cybersecurity and compliance services. I also want to have a disclosure because I have a financial interest in one of our sponsors, also connected to today's topic, iTrust, so just in the interest of full disclosure. And in case anyone's wondering where my accent's from, I was born and raised in South Africa. Okay, so moving on from there, our FAQs. Everyone wants to know, will the presentation be available? Of course, we'll provide a link. Presentation actually gets processed, and we'll provide a link within the next couple of days. And if you have any questions, please go ahead and send us your questions. We have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, and happy to take questions there. And we love those questions because it makes the whole experience interactive. So go ahead and send us questions as they pop up. All right, I'm going to dive straight into the agenda. We got a pretty aggressive agenda today, so I want to dive straight in. So first thing we're going to talk about is what is a cyber supply chain attack, and how does this relate back to our industry. We'll talk about the threat significance. So how big is this threat? Is this something that's pervasive? We'll talk about the different type of threat vectors coming from these type of attacks. And then we'll dive into a lot of detail into a cybersecurity supply chain risk management checklist. And that checklist really has three components to it: planning, pre-boarding, and ongoing assessments. So how do you engage with vendors, and what process should you follow? We've got some practical tips for our audience today as well. And then we'll talk about some countermeasures, how you can mitigate some of the risk, and how do you respond to a breach. And then we'll have, like I said, a Q&A session as well at the end. So look out for our polling questions. It'll get polled throughout the presentation, and respond to those. It's great information to have and to share with you. Some good crowdsourcing information. All right, so let's talk about our first topic and move on to the analysis of a supply chain attack. So essentially, there are two different variants of a supply chain attack. One involves where a hacker who would leverage one of a trusted third party's privileged access to infiltrate a system or data. And the second type is where a hacker will compromise the third party themselves that has access to your sensitive data. So let's start off with Joe. Joe, how prominent is this type of attack? Who do you think is at risk of these type of cyber supply chain attacks?
Right. So I don't think we can limit it, Trevor, to anyone, right? If we are dealing with a third party and or even within our organization itself, I think the attack vectors still maintains the exact same, in my opinion, in that we're all exposed in many ways to these attack vectors. It's the visibility of understanding, where the risks would be associated.
Great. And Jeff, do you see this as particularly targeting a particular type of vendor, or is this more pervasive across all different types of vendors?
Well,
Pardon me, Joe. Go ahead.
Please proceed forward, Jeff. I thought I heard my name, but maybe not.
Well, I was going to offer that. I think it's, as Joe said, I think you're going to see it happening with targets of opportunity and with specific targeted attacks as well, because the people that are going to perpetrate these crimes are going to either have a specific target in mind and find the path of least resistance, which is really what this boils down to. If you've ever done any physics work, you know that electricity or water, the natural course is to find a path of least resistance, and that's what a supply chain attack actually offers. So whether it's they just find an easy path or they have a target and look for the easy path, I think both are subject to it. And I think there are a lot of compliance issues there as well. And you can never ignore the fact that even though a lot of what we're going to talk about today is technical, social engineering is still the primary way to introduce a cyber attack through supply chain.
Yep, very good. One thing I wanted to point out, we don't even have kind of a taxonomy or naming conventions for these type of attacks. In particular, the attack where you're compromised through a third party who has access to your sensitive data. So I just kind of coined a term, I guess you could call that a side channel cyber supply chain attack. Quite a mouthful, but you heard it here first. Yeah, if that catches on, I definitely want to get a credit for it. Okay, moving on from there, let's look at how significant this threat is. Are we seeing this more and more across the board? And I mean, anecdotally, you'd see that we've had some fairly significant attacks on large companies. I guess the poster child for this was, a large retail company that got hacked a number of years ago, and the attack vector was through their heating and air conditioning vendor that got into one of their procurement systems and then tunneled all the way in. But Jeff, do you think that this attack is a significant threat?
I think it's a very significant threat. When you look at all the organizations that could be a target of an attack like this, I think you're going to see that, first of all, most of it stays under the radar. And in fact, I'm convinced that a lot of data breaches, whether they're reported or not effectively today, are the result of a chain such as what you just described, even if that's not evident at the time of the attack. I do think most of it is not yet recognized and is undercovered. The problem is much larger than we believe it is.
Yeah, I think on this slide, one of the most significant statistics is that 6% of companies don't even know if their vendors are sharing their information with other suppliers. That was very surprising for me to see. Those are very interesting stats.
I'll add one thing to that real quickly. In addition to that, you need to remember that 80% of data breaches are discovered by someone outside the organization that was breached. That actually is another leading indicator.
Right. Okay, moving on from there to talk about attack threat vectors. Joe, what's your thoughts on this? I think one of the things we need to distinguish is what I said earlier, a distinction between attacks that are initiated by the vendor, or via the vendor, and ones that are on the vendor. So attacks using like stolen credentials that, help someone get into, our back-end systems, or if the vendor gets compromised themselves. I mean, what do you feel in terms of these type of attack vectors? Are these things prominent? How are these attacks getting initiated?
Right. Yeah, so it goes back to what I said before. I think when we take a look at the various attack vectors, regardless of whether we're dealing with a third party and or we're dealing with our own individual organizations, those vectors are still, the same as Jeff made the comment earlier, that they follow the least passive resistance. So if you really take a look at the tech vectors, always saying what is it that they want to occur, what type of information do they want to obtain and for what purpose. So when we take a look at the various threat vectors, is what we do see today still prevalent, within the information security space. But I tend to measure them in several different methods when I'm dealing with either company and or third party. One is we take a look at, how they go after credentials. The other is really taking a look at the inside of threat, because we still see, a lot of that occurring as well. What some other things we see is things around, providing credentials and letting them stay dormant for a while. So that's another area of attack. The endpoint, what I call revolution of IoT. It's another area that we're seeing expanding, particularly if you look at the stats. Gartner actually says by 2020, over half of all businesses will incorporate some type of IoT. So I think that from an attack vector perspective will become another major area. And there's the whole idea of the disk risk management, data risk management side, to be able to understand exactly where your data would lie and how is that data exposed. You talked about some areas around the ideas, some of the other vendors that we would compromise, right? One major one, and looking at the POS devices and things of that nature. So I think, again, it's very broad from the attack vectors that whether you're a third party and or within an organization.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. So let's talk a little bit now about how we address these risks. So it's kind of an approach which makes sense and now is becoming more of an industry standard, and I guess it's intuitive as well, that any cybersecurity supply chain risk management process should have at least 3 components: a planning process, a pre-boarding risk assessment process. So before you bring the vendors on board, go through some sort of due diligence, and that would typically involve assessing not just cybersecurity risk, but also compliance risk. So think HIPAA, PCI, GDPR, other compliance frameworks. And then lastly, the ongoing assessments. And that's probably the area where we've seen the most innovation of doing these ongoing risk assessments or near real time. And I think that's one of the big changes that's taken place in our ability to get visibility. So let's dive into each one of those a little bit more detailed. Jeff, what's your take here in terms of planning? What sort of approach do we need to take? What sort of strategy should we put in place when we're planning to onboard new vendors into the environment?
So a rule I always like to use when planning on bringing on an additional supply chain component is keep it simple. And even though you think you keep it simple, take a look at it again and take out everything that isn't absolutely required for the supply chain transaction to occur. Once you do that, you're left with the core of this is information I must share, or these are transactions that I must allow to happen. You now have the core of what you need to assess and have the initial risk discussion with the third party to say these are the things that are important to us. You're going to need to show us how you're going to be dealing with this. So I'm going to give an example. I won't take long for this. Right now, many lenders, auto car lenders, it's just because I'm familiar with this, are being fined because they don't know what auto dealers are doing with securing personal information. So you're accepting risk for others, and you have to make sure you know what that is and get that space as small as possible.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And Joe, one of the other practices is this category of doing vendor categorization and mapping this activity and going through different threat scenarios. So what's your take on vendor categorization and mapping? What should companies be doing?
Yeah, so I think that's an important topic here because we already know that not all vendors are the same. And we really can't use a cookie cutter to have a single, format for every single vendor that we deal with or third party. So I think we need to really understand, based upon what type of services or what a product that the vendor may be offering to your organization itself. There's a difference in me dealing with a large company. For an example, that's going to be ordering me maybe infrastructure as a service or some SaaS product, as if I was going, as opposed to me, having a smaller business that's going to offer me some other level of service pertaining to that. So I think that from an organization perspective, you need to understand what your threats and what the impact of that service could be. I think the biggest area of concern that we would have as well is the continual assessment of that. And I think you may address this a little bit later. In that, I think we, as a company, we may do a pretty good job of maybe kicking off the initial assessment. But I think at the end of the day, it is a continuum because there could be technology changes. There could be company organizational changes through acquisition. It could be that the scope of work has changed. So in addition to just doing an initial assessment and understanding the impact, is adding that continual assessment to any vendor that you would do subscribe to services and or do business with.
Great, thank you for that. So moving on to the kind of next subtopic, which is doing pre-boarding risk assessment. So we've planned out, we've categorized all our vendors, we stratified them, high, medium, low risk, maybe based on different data points they may have. And then we move into the next phase, which is, okay, now we need to actually do the assessment. So typically this is done in two fashions. One is either an interview process or a survey that's sent out to the vendor that says, hey, tell us about your cybersecurity practices. So I like to call that the insider perspective. Like, tell us about how you do things. Then the next category moves into doing an independent security assessment, like doing some testing. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then going through some sort of compliance risk assessment, and then moving into doing independent assurance. So that may be doing getting third-party reports, SOC reports, PCR reports and compliance, any other sort of validation, maybe in a high trust report. And then the last component of this would be looking at their cyber reputation, which we'll talk about in a minute. Now, not every vendor who provides a service and not every company goes through each one of those steps. But again, this is more of a kind of a roadmap. So Jeff, what do you think about the insider perspective? How important a task is this, understanding the policies and procedures of a particular vendor?
Well, it's very important because once they're in your supply chain, they're really not independent. So whatever practices and policies they have become yours. And it's going to be very important that not only do you set expectations for where they should be, you need to confirm they're there. And this is where I get to embarrass Trevor, because I think dealing with supply chain is like having an active sex life. You know what steps you should take to keep yourself safe, and you know what risk you run should you not take those steps. And if you're wondering how boring this might be to you, that's one way of considering looking at it to say, hey, maybe this is more exciting than I thought.
Well, thank you for that perspective, Jeff. One of the things I like to add here is when we're looking at getting an understanding about risk in the environment, look to see if we can adopt some sort of formal standard. And the one that I'm most familiar with and being widely used in the industry is the NIST Cybersecurity Framework or the NIST 800-53, both of which are good approaches to understanding what risk is in the environment, really as a precursor to this onboarding process. All right, moving on from there into the next kind of component, doing this independent security assessment. And Joe, you kind of alluded to this a minute ago. Do you have any other things to expound on in terms of what sort of security testing we should be doing?
Yes, so I think I'll make this statement here is that vendor risk cannot be addressed by paperwork alone, right? And although it's a big part of it because you want to make sure you cover your legal components and set those expectations, I think really understanding what your attack vector would be and having that baseline so that you can measure against is extremely important. And what you're demonstrating here, I think in this slide here, is all the areas by which one could, take a look at in areas that they have to really assess, and being able to measure that, the assessment. It's what I see sometimes companies go out and they conduct an assessment, but they have no real measurement tools behind that to be able to identify what the real risks are. So being able to identify those components within what an assessment should include is extremely important.
Yeah, I think that's, that's great advice. And moving on to our next topic, which is looking at assessing compliance risk. So this goes back to you, Jeff. What are the requirements when it comes to this? How should we be addressing compliance risk relative to our vendors?
So there's really three components to this. The first one is ensuring that you have your risk appetite and your risk tolerance well defined for yourself before you ask anyone else to meet that standard. Because you certainly, if you can't say, here's the expectation and I'm doing this, you can't very well expect someone else to be doing it. The second thing is when you are in discovery with your supply chain, and they state, here's why we're compliant, or here's what we're doing, or here's a mitigating control, you need to make sure that you find a way to validate that. Now, I'm not suggesting that you do deep research on every single component, but the ones that are important to you that match where your risk tolerance is lower, you have to find a way to say, yes, you said you're doing this, and can you give me some evidence of that? Or let me go look at that. I think that's the most important thing of that component.
Yeah, and I think this becomes even more important when you look at either regulatory compliance requirements or industry requirements like PCI and HIPAA and GDPR that have a kind of domino or a chain effect within your supply chain. So PCI requirements 12.8, you need to be compliant yourself, and then 12.8 says you need to monitor the compliance of all your vendors. Same with HIPAA and GDPR as well, looking at that supply chain. One of the things I found very interesting, just looking at back to the NIST cybersecurity framework, there was a change made back in April where the new version came out, and the one significant change that they did to the framework was to add in this new threat vector of supply chain, cybersecurity supply chain as a new threat vector, and included that in the framework. Just kind of speaks again to how important this issue is becoming. I want to delve a little bit into talking about independent assurance. This happens to be one of my areas of expertise, and this is, I think, important for the audience to understand when we are gathering information from our vendors, and that is understanding the difference between different SOC reports, in particular a Type 1 report versus a Type 2. And a Type 1 report for SOC purposes, and it could be a SOC 1 or a SOC 2. A Type 1 report is done at a point in time, and a Type 2 report is done over a period of time. And a minimum period of time per the AICPA is 6 months. Typically, a SOC 2 or a SOC 1 is done, if it's a Type 2 report, is done over a 12-month period. But it's important to understand the distinction. The Type 2 report is considered to be, obviously, the gold standard Type 1 report, and you don't get a whole lot of assurance for that. So when you are asking for these reports, make sure you're specifying the type of report you need. Another thing is look at testing periods. Often testing periods don't align, and if they don't align, find out what happened in the intervening period. Was there a gap in controls that the vendor missed and they weren't able to produce a report at that time? Investigate those. And one of the most important sections in any SOC report is specifically in the Type 2 report, is look at what's called the user or client considerations, which are controls that you need to have in your environment to complement that vendor's controls. And that's a very important component and often overlooked by a lot of companies, just gloss through when they're looking at the report. And lastly, sub-service providers. And this is the vendors, so other people that they rely on. So let's say you're using a software platform and the platform is hosted by a cloud provider. So they call the cloud provider, in this case, would be a sub-service provider. Do the cloud provider or that sub-service provider, do they have their own SOC report? So those are important things to look at and validate when you're looking at getting independent assurance. Moving on to the next topic, I'll go back to Joe on this. Joe, let's talk a little bit about cyber reputation. How important is it to understand what other people are saying about your vendors? Is it a critical part of the framework of an approach, or is this kind of just a nice to have?
Well, I think it's thoroughly important because you really need to take a crowdsourced approach when you are dealing with your vendors. The likelihood of us being able to identify all the flaws, all the concerns around a specific vendor, it's very difficult to do. But the idea to be able to have other input about a specific third party or vendor around their security programs or how they handle security measurements and what their reputation would be, it's very important to someone who's looking to fulfill a service or a product through a specific vendor.
And Jeff, what do you think of this cybersecurity reputation? Is this worthwhile?
Oh, it's absolutely. It's critical and it's essential. And it's also one of the toughest things to pin down because you have to be able to find some independent views of what's going on. And I don't think it should be as simple as the equivalent of a credit check or a background check that said, oh, they've never had a breach. Well, if they've never had a breach and they've been in business more than 10 years, someone isn't telling the truth. To me, it's important to be transparent enough to say, here's the problems we've had, and more importantly, here's what we've put in place to ensure that doesn't happen again. And that's how I think a good cyber reputation is built.
I think all great points. I think one of the challenges, obviously, with this is also looking at these fourth-party relationships. So if you're using a vendor, your vendor's vendors, how do you even understand what that whole chain looks like? And that's obviously a big challenge across the industry because there's no easy way to gather the information. There is technical tools that can help you assess that, but a lot of those relationships are kind of hidden under the covers. Mm-hmm. And this is where you can bring back in that initial phase we were talking about during the planning phase, doing a lot of due diligence and getting some disclosures as part of that process. So asking smart questions as part of your onboarding process. Who else do you rely on? And then obviously keeping that information current is very important because vendors change all the time, and your vendor may have a new vendor that they're using, and it changes the security posture overall. So getting visibility into that, I think, is another very important approach. Let's get into the last section, which is talking about ongoing monitoring. So again, our three different phases of going through the checklist would be the planning phase we discussed, the pre-boarding, what assessments you do up front, and then this last section, which is ongoing monitoring, which to me is probably the most valuable and also an area where we've seen the most innovation. So back to Joe, what do you think as far as this ongoing monitoring? What sort of scope should we do? What sort of frequency? How do we address these ongoing monitoring concerns?
Right. Yeah, so I think I alluded to that a little while back pertaining to the continuum of assessments and the continuum monitoring side of that. So I think when you're defining the scope, you really need to understand the holistic perspective of a specific vendor or their entire cyber or their information security posture. So again, you need to have some systems and tools in place to do that. It's probably not likely that an organization is going to, particularly if you deal with multiple vendors, have an internal source that goes out and monitor these specific vendors and be able to manage them the same way they would manage their internal information security. So it becomes dependent upon other resources to be able to help you assist and manage that portion of your program. As far as the frequency, I think again, we always want to aim to have real-time information, right? If we put 6 months or a year gap in that, well, we have a whole 6 months or year in between all that for something to occur or for something to change. So therefore, cyber is only as good as the real-time information on how quickly we can get that information, so that we can prevent, maybe a major vulnerability or a major change in an infrastructure that could prevent a breach. So I think the frequency on this is would that be you want to build some type of system, whether it's a continuum. Yes, there will be your yearly follow-ups and things that most companies should be doing. But I think the idea to be able to have some process, some system in place to be able to feed you information about a third party or vendor is highly desirable.
Dan, going back to something, Jeff, I think you said this earlier, is understanding what your risk tolerance is. So how does that kind of play back into this ongoing monitoring? You set different thresholds for vendors based on some sort of impact, a high, medium, or low impact?
Yeah, and I think that's a good approach to take, because you can't do everything with everyone all the time. Otherwise, this problem wouldn't exist. So if you can rank your supply chain vendors into 3 groups, or maybe even 4, whatever's going to work for you, what you want to do is set a cadence for each of those. Because in essence, what you're doing with your ongoing monitoring is repeating most, if not all, of the steps you took when you did the initial risk assessment. Some of those obviously can be skipped, but you're repeating most of that. And the higher impact or the greater scope that a vendor has, the more often you probably want to do that. So I think having 3 or 4 categories and setting a cadence for ongoing monitoring makes a lot of sense. I also offer, this is when communication is key, and not enough of us talk about information sharing, using something like an ISAC or an ISAO to ensure that you're aware of what the current threats are and you're aware of what attacks are going on, so you know when they may hit the sector that you're working with and get a little more advanced notice.
Yeah, that's a great point about information sharing. I think we're actually going to talk about that as one of the countermeasures and how to approach this in a minute. Another point I wanted to make here as far as the last item, which is remediation action plans. And I think this approach to when you're working with vendors is there's a codependency between an enterprise and a vendor in terms of how you're conducting business, because if that vendor was non-essential, then you wouldn't really use them. So having a proper process in place for doing remediation in a collaborative fashion, I think, is very valuable. I think some of the assessment tools that are being used in the market are almost adversarial, so they can go and do like a scan of someone's site and then bring back a rating, and then that information is not even necessarily shared with the vendor. I think that's a mistake and doesn't really foster the type of collaboration that will get results. So if you're interested in remediation and interested in improving the risk rating of that vendor, I think it relies on more collaboration. And when you do find an issue, this remediation, creating an action plan that's a joint plan between the vendor and the enterprise, so that the vendor can actually go and fix the issue, whatever it may be, a vulnerability or a policy procedure that's not being executed the way that the enterprise would like. I think those are all very valuable tools to have, and an approach that makes a lot of sense. So moving on to our next topic, and I'll go back to Joe. Let's talk about some countermeasures. How should we be kind of working with the vendors and enterprises, how they should be collaborating? What sort of process do you think makes sense here in terms of how you interact with one another?
Yeah, so I think it goes back to what was stated already, is really opening up the communication. I'll give you an example of what I mean by that as well, but I think the trust relationship and to understand what the threats and what again, the service or product you're doing is going to help you gauge to understand where the concerns would be. And it also varies based upon the type of organization that you deal with, whether it's a large company or a small company. I'll give you an example of opening up some communications and really helping vendors to maybe, strengthen their security platform, but not in a non-threatening way. As an example that we experienced here not too long ago is that we had a vendor, a fairly small business, reputable, had a great solution that they wanted to offer and it met our requirements. But when we peel back the onion and doing that assessment, we understood that there was some lacking in some of the security best practices. So we built that trust, we built that relationship, so we were able to open that up. And as a bigger company who in fact, have a security program in place, was able to assist them to better equip them to understand what the security concerns were. So we can't assume that every company that we deal with, every third party that we deal with, have a mature security understanding. So the idea about opening up, first of all, communication and open and understanding how you can really support and help each other in that type of environment is extremely helpful. So don't take the assumption, again, as I said, that everyone understands security. So I think building trust, don't be afraid as well also to make audit conditions in contract renewals and have some discussions around that. But again, do it in a way that you're really fostering collaboration. And then also talk about, the incident response component of it. Set your expectations to understand that in the event that there is a security matter, particularly around this, here's how we typically handle it. Here's what here's how our response need to occur. So I think from a countermeasures perspective, I think it's all in the upfront part of that as well, and making sure that you have that appropriate communication and that relationship built with that vendor.
Great. And Jeff, you spoke a little bit earlier about information sharing. Can you expand a little bit on that? Like what sort of information sharing platforms you would recommend? I know one of the things that's useful is if both the vendor and the enterprise are InfraGard members, because they're going to have access to, often some sensitive information and that could potentially impact their security posture. Do you have any other recommendations on information sharing?
I do, and there's a lot from which every organization can choose, so you need to figure out which one makes sense for you. Some of the ones that have been around for a while that are well established, in addition, obviously, to InfraGard, are ISACs. There's state ISACs, there's financial services ISACs, there's a number for each specific large industry. And the purpose of those is to get early access to information about attacks, vulnerabilities, or social engineering efforts that are taking place within that given platform. Another similar one, which is one I happen to have some knowledge of here working with what I do at UTSA, are ISAOs, which are often a bit less formal than ISACs, but the whole point of it is to say, we have some information and we're going to share that and we want to see what else is going on. Without that communication and trust, and Joe hit the nail on the head when he said it, without communication and trust, your countermeasures will be ineffective.
Yeah, it's all great feedback and great info to share with our audience. So moving on to kind of last formal topic here, response. So this really talks about what do we do in the event that we do have a data breach or a security leak or some sort of security incident with a vendor. How do we approach this? So go back to you, Joe. Like, what do we do here as far as a response? What's appropriate?
Yeah. So I think we have to go back with the premises. Don't be afraid of the breach, right? I think we have enough evidence around us at this particular point in time that it's not a matter of if. It's for most of it's a matter of when. And the idea about open communication, building the relationship, building the trust, so that you can collaborate with your vendors, with your third-party organizations, to be able to report when they see instances that may occur. It gives you that head start, that jump start, to be able to start to address your typical, identification all the way down through your remediation, eradication part of that particular risk area. So as far as the incident response, is really having them to understand, even the basic stuff, that if we have an incident, who do we contact, right? Is there a process in place by which we can report a potential breach or a breach, so that you can also get that rolling as fast as you can, because we know from a regulatory perspective, and particularly some states, there are certain timeframes by which you also have to do these reportings. So again, it goes back to, I think, what we said before, is making sure that communication is there and that they understand, what the reporting and notification criteria would be, and the responsibilities.
And Jeff, I know you've had the experience on both the receiving and the consulting sort of end on breach responses. What is your take? Do we need a completely new plan for handling an incident that occurs at a vendor, or is this just an add-on to our existing incident response plan? A whole new way of thinking? What's your take?
Well, some of it's going to depend on what your plans are right now. And if you don't have a good, solid set of plans right now, then yes, you're going to have a new one for your vendors. But it's going to be much better when you integrate any certain transaction or sharing of data with vendors into your existing plans, because when a breach occurs and it's within the supply chain, all participants have to be engaged. You can't just say, oh, here's a separate plan. I will make, as you said, I've been involved in both sides of incidents, and I will make a statement that I'm going to consider it a maxim. I've never, ever seen a successful recovery occur where a plan that was in place was followed step by step and everything was predicted and worked as planned. Although I've seen many successful recoveries, but they all started with their plan and realized from muscle memory or because they did testing, knew, oh, here's a separate branch I need to take, or here's something I need to add in. Now, on the flip side of that, I've never seen a successful recovery occur without a plan, period. And I don't have to put any qualifiers on that.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Okay, so we're going to move on to kind of the QA part of the presentation, and we've got about 8 minutes left here, and we've got some good questions from the audience, and anyone who would like to contribute to that can please go ahead. So the first question I think we've already responded to, which are the slides available for download, and answer is yes, we'll be providing a link to that. We had a question from someone in Chesterfield, and their question was, has blockchain had or will have, how will this impact the transmission of data through the supply chain? What's the impact going to be? I think the question is related to blockchain technologies. Is that going to have a dramatic impact on how we manage risk within vendors, or is the technology really irrelevant? Joe? Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, I think it's going to be very important and very beneficial. It's not going to be beneficial this year yet, but the whole point of blockchain and having a ledger gives you an irrefutable track of every transaction that occurred within the ledger. What that allows you to do, whether you use blockchain to do a risk assessment or you use blockchain to track every transaction that occurs or every interaction that might occur between a vendor and yourself, when used properly, it will give you, for now, an irrefutable track of here's everything that occurred. It helps both in forensics and in validating the trust relationship.
Trevor, to add to that, I agree 100% with Jeff. However, it does not cover the full scope of data protection, right? So it covers the idea of how we secure the data when we're transmitting information or maintaining information. But we already know that, as Jeff alluded to earlier, the bad actors are going to follow the least passive resistance. That's going to be, again, still through our employees and through the individual user or through other type of endpoints, right, which may already visibility into that process prior to it going through a session like that. So I still think you have to have really comprehensive look into the entire cybersecurity program rather than taking a look at one technology that's embedded in.
Okay, next question we have is, how do we assess the risks of large vendors such as AWS, Google, Microsoft? So Joe or Jeff, what's your thoughts on that? I know it's a challenge when you've got these large enterprises, and particularly if you're using only a small component of their services. How do you kind of go about assessing risk for those large companies?
Right. So
go ahead, Joe, please.
yeah, I think we still start off with the basics, right? Now, we already know that most of the large companies are going to already go through the appropriate attestations and security evaluations and have the certifications and so forth in place. So I think it breaks it down to what are you using the services for, right? What type of service am I using? Am I using infrastructure as a service? Is it a SaaS? Am I standing up a truly using cloud services? And then what am I using those for? So it's really understanding what you're using the service for will dictate where your concerns would be and the areas that you particularly have to address. Some of the concerns that I take a look at is that if there is an incident or if there's a concern that comes up, what do I have visibility into? What information could I obtain? And those are the questions that I would typically ask. Not that are you ISO or do you have an SA16? We know that's covered. But again, what I want to know is that what information as a company do I have exposure to so that I can provide some level of assurance to the information security component of that.
Jeff, did you want to add something?
Yeah, you're sharing your risk with these large providers, so you're getting in a big pool. The good news about that is they have a lot of resources to apply to be compliant and to be secure, and it's in their best interest to do that. On the other hand, it's much easier for them to bury vulnerabilities and make them not visible to you. So it again goes to the concept of establish the trust. If it's a large vendor, they're going to have a SOC 2 report. Get that. Take a good look at it. Don't accept the report and say, I have the report, everything's good. Something else I'll say, there's two components in it, and one working in each direction. I've seen small companies say, I have a SOC 2 report because I'm hosted at one of those large cloud vendors, and they believe that the cloud vendor SOC 2 report covers them, and it does not. So I think we need to keep that in mind. You know, the supply chain risk does go in both directions. On the other hand, let's say you have healthcare information, you're obligated to make sure that the cloud provider is going to sign on with the business associate agreement, because they now have some level of control over PHI. So you need to remember the two-way communication that happens all the time.
Okay, our next question is, do I need consent to do a cyber risk rating on a vendor using scanning tools? So I guess they're talking about if we went and an enterprise went and just started scanning a vendor's environment and looking for vulnerabilities, do we need consent for that? I guess it's maybe not from even a legal perspective, but maybe from just kind of a business ethics perspective. Joe?
Yeah, so we'll bypass, as you stated, the legal components of what that really means. But I think that if you're taking a look at real cyber rating, the consent or the cooperation with the vendor works best. I've been on the other side of that, by which, you have individuals to assess us, these other third-party vendors, and a client will come back to us and saying, well, you received this rating, right, in a specific area. And can you please address or tell me why the rating may be a certain level, or that may be below, for an example, what their qualification was. And when you really dig down into the components of that, what it really came back and said is that they measured some ranges or some information that was not necessarily 100% accurate. And if they had contacted us, we could inform them of that, which would in turn pushed out to a more, not only comprehensive, but more of a report that was where the accuracy was more nipped to what it really is. So I think the idea about scanning a system and reporting on it gives you some level of data, but you're not going to have, again, the fullness and the accuracy without that cooperation, I think, with the vendor so that you can potentially get additional information and then build those relationships so they understand, here's what I'm doing.
Yeah, I think that goes back to our whole discussion about collaboration and building that trust between the enterprise and the vendor. If you're doing things by stealth, it's kind of underhanded. And I know one of our clients expressed a concern to us because they felt that they had been scanned and they had to defend against their partner who was scanning their website and gathering information in stealth mode. So our next question, and this I think will be our kind of final question before we do a quick wrap up, and this will be for Jeff. How do you explain cyber supply chain risks to upper level management?
You do it the same way that you explain every component of what you're doing in risk management or security or compliance to upper management. It boils down to, here's what's important to our company. By the way, I'm going to go back to, have you determined your risk appetite and your risk tolerance? If you have not, then whatever you try to explain is going to probably sound like gibberish and they may not care. Fundamental, establish your risk tolerance, determine your risk appetite, and make sure that the people to whom you're explaining everything know that and own it. And then everything you explain is either inside your risk tolerance or outside your risk tolerance. And then it boils down to, how do you address that risk? Do you transfer it, do you mitigate it, or do you accept it?
Very good.
Trevor, I'll make one comment.
Go ahead.
As far as this cyber supply chain risk, many organizations look at that as an add-on to your overall security program. In my opinion, that needs to be embedded into your program. Mm-hmm. So don't approach it as an additional component to what we're doing in security. It needs to be a part of security. And I think if you add that in as a standard component, it makes it a little easier to effectively explain the entire process from the risk perspective, as opposed to saying we have security and now we have third-party risk, right? To me, it's all the same.
Very good. That's a great comment. Okay, so we just got really 1 minute left. Just do a quick wrap up. So I'll let Jeff, if you got any kind of last minute word of advice for our audience.
Yeah, embrace your supply chain because it's you. And I'm going to repeat something Joe said. Don't make it a checklist. A checklist is a good, in my opinion, small component of your entire risk management program for supply chain. Don't make it a checklist. Make it part of what you do every day and fully embrace it because it's just as important as the computer sitting in your data center or on your desk. Very good. And Joe, final word?
Yeah, just really quick is that, security is always strongest, the weakest link. I know it's an old cliche, but, I think what we're really realizing is that one of those major weak links that we have is our supply chain, and that we really have to engage and start reaching out and communicating to ensure that we have a complete program in place by which the strength from that is through your company and anyone who you deal with as well. So that would be my final comment.
Okay, thank you so much. Jeff, Joe, thank you for your participation. Thank you to our audience. Thank you to everyone supporting InfraGard Atlanta through our webinar series. And look out for more information. We'll be having a webinar coming up in approximately 6 weeks. And hope to see all of our audience again. Thank you, everyone. It's been a pleasure.